Despite what the title might imply, this isn't really a standalone video. It's actually a follow-up to the Busting Tank Myths video. In said video, one of the topics I covered was shot traps on modern tanks, where I talked about two things: the upper front plate on the Abrams, and the turret cheeks on the Leopard 2. When talking about the Abrams, I said it wasn't a shot trap, because APFSDS generally starts to shatter around 80 degrees. Since I made that video, there has been a lot of discussion on that topic, with some people pitting my video against another YouTubers. I want to make it clear before we start, this is not a response video or anything, especially since we agree on a lot of points. If anything, this is me explaining my point more thoroughly. Before we get into the video proper, I want to take a second to talk about my sponsor. I partner with Apex Gaming to make a line of pre-built gaming PCs, so if you're looking to upgrade, they might be worth checking out. You can use my username as a discount code on checkout. Link is in the description and comments. With that out of the way, let's get back into it. Funnily enough, the source the other YouTuber used is the same one I used. We just came to different conclusions. It's called Ricochet of a tungsten heavy alloy long rod projectile from deformable steel plates. The main point of the study was to determine how you could increase the critical ricochet angle of APFSDS. They did this by running a number of variable tests. The thickness of the plate as well as the LD ratio of the rod were unchanged, but the angle of the plate and the velocity of the round were adjusted. Their conclusion was that the higher the round's velocity, the shallower the ricochet angle. They also concluded that when the plates were angled more, the round could ricochet without shattering. When the plate wasn't angled as much, the tip of the round could ricochet while the tail of the round could penetrate the plate. This is massively oversimplifying things, but it gets the point across. Based on that, the upper front plate on the Abrams does seem like a pretty fatal flaw. Since most darts have velocities towards the upper end of this chart, their ricochet angle would be shallower. That would mean that instead of striking the turret face, they would hit the turret ring, right? And even if they did break, the rear portion would still penetrate the plate. Unfortunately, this doesn't take some things into consideration. First of all, the relative thicknesses of the rod and plate are way off. The test plate was 6.25mm thick. The round had a diameter of 7mm, and a length of 75mm. Take the thickness of the plate and divide it by the diameter of the rod, you end up with 0.89. Now let's try a more realistic scenario. Say M829A1 versus the upper front plate of an Abrams. There's been some debate over how thick the plate is on newer Abrams tanks, but let's assume they stayed a constant 38.1mm. Now divide that by M829A1's diameter, 24mm. That gives you 1.58. That's a pretty big discrepancy. For 3BM42, which remains the most commonly used 125mm round, that ranges from 1.31 to 2.1, since the round is about 29mm, but the actual penetrator is around 18. M829 gives you 1.41. As you can imagine, you can't just angle a 1mm plate at 82 degrees and expect it to auto-bounce APFSDS. You can also imagine that this had a pretty big impact on the tests, which the research paper mentions. And there's another thing. This test was meant to produce ricochet angles, not test the effects of them. So as far as I can tell, nowhere do they mention the penetration of the round or the exit angle. Let's talk about the exit angle first. In order to ricochet into the turret ring, the round would need to hit fairly close to it, and at rather high velocity too. In most scenarios, the round would likely bounce up and penetrate the bottom of the turret, where it would embed itself in the composite armor arrays. Either that, or it would strike the turret face, the latter being especially likely at longer ranges, where muzzle velocity drops off a bit. Now about penetration, or more accurately, round integrity. You would expect that after ricocheting, the round would lose a decent amount of velocity, but that isn't actually the case. The velocity is relatively unchanged. What does happen though, is that during the ricochet the rear portion of the rod slows down pretty significantly. Since the tip is going at essentially the same speed, this deforms and stretches the rod, even though it doesn't necessarily shatter. This stretching will introduce strain and fractures, both of which will reduce the round's performance. This is essentially the best case scenario as well. Either way, it's incredibly unlikely that the rod will have enough power to fully penetrate. At best it would jam the turret ring, which to be fair is still a mission kill. There is a real scenario in which two Abrams were struck in that general area. During Desert Storm, two tanks were struck by friendly uranium rounds. The first tank, B-66, was hit directly under the turret. The round penetrated and killed the gunner. The second tank, B-22, was struck on the upper front plate while trying to help B-66. After hitting the mine plow bracket, the round shattered on the upper front plate. This demonstrates that while the upper front plate could make ammo as potent as M829A1 shatter, the turret ring itself is still a weak spot, even if it is a relatively small one. As mentioned earlier, even a deformed round could jam the turret ring. I wouldn't call it a shot trap, since shooting the turret ring on pretty much every tank will do that. Of course, people were calling the area a shot trap before the M1 was even in service. Louis Felder, manager of the XM1 program at Chrysler, responded with this: "In any tank there are certain areas, nooks and crannies, that are impossible to guard, but in this particular tank design, I consider those nooks and crannies to be at an absolute minimum." So to summarize, APFSDS can bounce, but it's pretty rare, and drastically reduces the dart's performance. The upper front plate on the Abrams isn't some magic shoot to win zone, but it also isn't invulnerable to all projectiles. Areas like the turret ring, driver's hatch, and top portion of the plate can still be exploited. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.